my great honor and pleasure to be able to welcome you to this evening's lecture entitled The Palestinian Refugee Issue in Israel-American Relations to 1967. Our guest is Ronald Zweig. My name is Michael Kennedy, and I am director of the Watson Institute for International Studies. I will introduce Professor Zweig more properly in a moment, but allow me a few words of introduction about the Watson Institute's approach to international studies. When I came to Brown 8 months ago, one of the obvious challenges I faced as director of the Watson was to figure out how best to work with a very distinguished faculty and Brown's administrators to help shape new understandings of international studies. How do we move beyond the reproduction of familiar accounts of the world to ask new and consequential questions about that world? Actually, the Watson Institute was founded with just that motivation. In the midst of the Cold War, where my predecessors asked very sophisticated questions about that contest between superpowers, with answers that we would hope would reduce the likelihood of nuclear exchange. Today, the Watson Institute is also very well known for asking different kinds of questions, like how inequalities shape development, like how international security is constructed, like how various global processes are mediated and regulated. But one should also recognize that the Watson Institute is not only well known in existing fields, it's making new ones too. Flows is one keyword to that making. Each flow has its own discipline. Economics studies flows of money, anthropology studies flows of cultural artifacts, sociology studies flows of ideas, and so on. Globalization, of course, is often described with reference to the increasing speed and regularity of which various flows of money, images, ideas, and goods cross national boundaries. But of course, flows are not distinctive to the internet era. In particular, the movement of peoples across various kinds of borders has been one of the most important foundations on which states have been built and cultures of global cooperation and conflict have been made. The subject of this evening's lecture is an exemplar of how the movement of people, in this case Palestinian refugees, has shaped a complex network of international relations over the past 4 decades. It is a subject that has deeply moving personal narratives, economic underpinnings, legal implications, and sometimes contentious political implications. But it is also a subject that has a rich, layered, and nuanced history, a history that has helped shape and in turn been shaped by America's foreign policies in the Middle East. And we are fortunate tonight to be joined by a most distinguished historian, Ron Zweig, who will be sharing insights from his own scholarly research on this subject. Professor Zweig is the Taub Professor of Israel Studies, Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, Director of the Taub Center for Israel Studies, and the Academic Director of the Paths to Peace program, all at New York University. And it tires me out just to list it, much less conduct all that work. Dr. Zweig has a PhD in modern history from the University of Cambridge, England. In 1977 and 78, he was the Junior Fellow in Modern History at Oxford University Center for Hebrew Studies, after which he joined Hebrew University, Jerusalem. In 1983, he transferred to the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University, serving as chair between 2003 and 2004. From 1990 to 1993, he was director of the Institute for Research in the History of Zionism. Dr. Zweig has been a visiting professor also at several U.S. universities, as well as a visiting fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge, Yad Vashem, Jerusalem, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. He was a member as well of the Historical Advisory Panel to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. But titles don't a scholar make. Professor Zweig has published 3 books: Britain and Palestine During the Second World War, German Reparations and the Jewish World, A History of the Claims Conference, and The Gold Train. He's published many scholarly articles and edited 3 collections of essays. Between 1983 and 2000, he edited the history, and was also the editor of the online edition of the Palestinian Post, a retrospective newspaper digitization project focusing on 1932 to 1950. Amongst historians in particular, Professor Zweig has a reputation for producing histories that are deeply researched and using a vast range of original archival materials. This evening, we are able to learn firsthand the fruits of such historical labor. So please welcome, with me, Ron Zweig, who will be speaking on the Palestinian refugee issue in Israel-American relations to 1967.
Thank you, Michael. I barely recognized myself in that introduction. Let me start just with a personal note of introduction of my own, not about myself, but about one of my students. I was attracted to this subject because I've had a lifelong interest in refugee affairs, and I've written extensively about Jewish refugees. I then turned my attention to Israeli policy on Palestinian refugees, and as any professor can aspire, as one does aspire to, I was lucky enough to have a very brilliant young student who chose to do a dissertation under my direction on the subject of Israeli policy to the Palestinian refugees after 1948. Dr. Shelley Fried wrote a pioneering study, and we were looking forward to the publication of this work when unfortunately Shelley died as a young man. It is my intention to publish his research, but in order to do so, dissertations are limited, doctoral dissertations are limited. They need to have a broader perspective to cover a larger period. I have decided to fill out the missing chapters of his work, and what you will hear tonight is the fruit of that research for somebody else's book. For most of the 1950s and 1960s, the Palestinian refugee problem was at the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict and was the most visible manifestation of its consequences. The fate of the refugees, repatriation or resettlement and compensation, was the largest hurdle in all plans to resolve the conflict. Yet strangely enough, the refugee issue has not gained the scholarly attention in either English or Hebrew that such a central issue would normally attract. I cannot comment on Arab historiography, although I believe the situation is very similar. With very few exceptions, the refugee problem was marginalized in the various studies of the tentative peace feelers between Israel and each of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the pre-1967 period, in the studies of Israeli foreign policy in general, or in the studies of relations between the United States and Israel. There is a disconnect between the centrality of the problem and the academic attention it has attracted. Although Israeli archives have been open to research for 30 years, the first doctoral dissertations on Israel's policy to the Palestinian refugees were only completed a few years ago, and the first monograph on the subject published last year in Hebrew. The scholarly study of the origins and causes of the refugee problem and the degree of Israeli responsibility for its creation have been the subject of furious debate for over 20 years now, but the subsequent course of events and the extent to which Israeli policy was even concerned about refugee issues has been largely ignored. This scholarly lack of attention was completely consistent with the official Israeli agenda. From the very outset, 1 month after Israel's independence in May 1948, as the extent of the Palestinian flight became apparent, Israeli policy hardened on the decision that Palestinian Arabs fleeing the civil war that they had just lost and the ongoing hostilities resulting from the invasion of the Arab states that followed, these refugees would not be allowed to return. This became the cornerstone of Israeli thinking, even as the fighting spread beyond the United Nations partition borders and the Palestinian flight was increasingly caused by direct Israeli action, including instances of forced expulsion. By the time it was over, 726,000 Palestinians, approximately 50% of the Arab population of the whole previous territory of British Mandatory Palestine, had abandoned or been dislodged from their homes and become refugees. Israel was determined to preserve the demographic outcome of its War of Independence. By the end of hostilities in 1949, Israel controlled more territory and far fewer Arabs than originally designed. Preserving this dual outcome became the cornerstone of Israeli policy for the next 20 years. Achieving peace with its Arab neighbors was also an important goal of Israeli policy, but only if it could be achieved with minimal territorial or demographic concessions. America and Britain instinctively understood and eventually accepted this situation de facto, and their interventions in the Arab-Israeli conflict were designed to tweak Israeli policy by encouraging larger concessions on territory and especially concessions on refugees as bait to the Arab states, but they never demanded a complete reversal of the situation to the status quo ante. In its public diplomacy, Israel justified its opposition to the repatriation of refugees and in favor of their resettlement in the Arab countries by referring to the many refugee problems that had been created during the first half of the 20th century and quickly resolved when the refugees were dispersed rather than allowed to fester in refugee camps. Parallels were drawn to the recent precedents of Soviet policy after World War II, no displaced persons camps in Eastern Europe, no United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and therefore no refugees. The Indian and Pakistani experience in dealing with the refugee problem created by partition on the subcontinent, Israel's own experience in 1948 with the 12% of the Jewish population internally uprooted by the fighting of that war, by the mass Jewish immigration of 1948 to 51 and continuing 1954 to 1960 from the Arab world, and even the American-led effort to resettle Jewish and non-Jewish post-World War II refugees in Europe. And the classic case, 25 years earlier, of the resettlement of Greek refugees from Turkey in the 1920s. The lesson of all these experiences, most of them significantly larger than the Palestinian refugee problem of 1948-49, was that the rapid resettlement of uprooted populations was the surest way of minimizing long-term human suffering and preventing irredentism. Anything else was a cynical exploitation of the consequences of war for political ends, which should not be rewarded. From this perspective, Israel considered the existence of the United Nations organized relief effort for the Palestinian refugees, and in particular the American underwriting of the UN-run camps, as a misguided use of humanitarian sentiment that perpetuated the problem. Focusing attention on the Palestinian refugee problem, Israel argued, simply helped keep the problem alive. Given this facade of apparent willful neglect, it came as no surprise to discover that it did come as a surprise to discover that the Israeli Foreign Ministry was not at all indifferent to the Palestinian refugee issue. Indeed, it was one of the central concerns of Israeli foreign policy makers. The refugee problem was under constant discussion within the ministry. A large part of the ministry's diplomatic resources was spent on the maneuvers and lobbying necessary to avoid censure in the annual debate on the refugee question in the General Assembly of the United Nations. At the outset, in the months and then first years after the creation of the problem, the State Department placed placed a large part of the onus of a solution on Israel, with the expectation that Israel would allow the repatriation of up to a third of the refugees. When that did not happen, the focus of American diplomacy shifted to sustaining the refugees through the humanitarian work of the specially created United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which began operations in May 1950. The Eisenhower administration, which was generally unsympathetic to Israeli concerns, slipped into a policy similar to Israel's, minimizing the political significance of the refugee problem and treating it as a humanitarian one, which was contained by the existence of relief agencies. And this despite the fact that during the Republican administration, American Jewish voters had no influence in Washington at all. So this, I'm laying the grounds for further observations on that aspect. Ironically, the situation was reversed during the administration that followed. John F. Kennedy was supported by Jewish voters, and he did have Jewish advisors. And it was they who placed the Palestinian refugee issue, ironically, firmly on the new president's agenda. It is this episode, Kennedy's refugee policy, and the Joseph Johnson plan, and the Israeli response to this plan, that I wish to examine in detail tonight. Kennedy had expressed his concern with the Palestinian refugee problem already during the election campaign in 1960, in a private meeting with Jewish supporters, both as a humanitarian issue that needed to be resolved, and because it was an obstacle to peace diplomacy in the Middle East. The president's interest was reinforced by the evolution of State Department thinking on the refugee issue. Originally, the expectation was that UNRWA would alleviate the immediate humanitarian crisis and eventually facilitate the integration of the refugees into the local economies of the host countries by expanding employment opportunities and encouraging local development. But this did not happen. By the end of the 1950s, after 10 years of frustrated expectation that the refugees would be rehabilitated through the works programs of UNRWA, the State Department placed the failure of the Arab states to enable refugee resettlement and rehabilitation on the same moral balance as the failure of Israel to allow the right of return. The rights and wrongs of the refugee issue were increasingly obscured by day-to-day practical concerns. The United States carried 70% of the budgetary burden of maintaining UNRWA, and Congress was becoming increasingly resentful of this burden. This was particularly so when it became apparent that there was a serious traffic in refugee identity cards, which had become a tradable asset, and that the refugee rolls were hopelessly inflated. I discovered that in Jordan in 1960 you could actually get a mortgage using your refugee identity card as collateral. Congress demanded a, quote, rectification of the rolls, a process which led to the actual shrinking of the number of refugees registered in Jordan, which hosted more than half of the refugees, by approximately 1% in each of 1960 and 1961. Although the process was limited given, quote, the delicate Jordanian political situation. Furthermore, UNRWA had been created with a 10-year mandate, which would expire in April 1961. Even if there had been no political desire to end the refugee problem, the anticipated end of UNRWA's mandate ensured that something would have to be done. The final factor, weighing in the scale of American deliberations, was a growing concern that UNRWA was not only the means by which the refugee problem was being perpetuated, but that its extensive educational program was generating a radical Palestinian nationalism, which would eventually infect the entire Middle East. To quote from the State Department brief sent to Kennedy 3 months after the start of his administration, reports available to us had indicated that at 2 recent Arab League meetings, decisions had been taken to launch an Algerian-type movement designed ultimately to eliminate Israel. Thus, we felt it was important to nip this move in the bud. Given all of these considerations, the time had clearly arrived for a fresh attempt to solve the refugee problem permanently. The State Department announced a generalized intention of reactivating the Palestinian Conciliation Commission, and through that organization, to examine the possibilities for addressing, in a very generalized way, possibilities for a solution. There is some evidence to suggest that it was Kennedy's closest Jewish advisors, Mike Feldman, or Meir Feldman, his assistant legal counsel, and indirectly Abraham Feinberg, a major supporter of the Democratic Party and a White House regular, that bridged the gap between the growing sense of urgency in the State Department and Kennedy's own Middle East agenda. And I will return to these two names, Feldman and Feinberg. In May 1961, soon after the start of his presidency, Kennedy addressed a letter to various heads of state in the Arab world, expressing a desire for good relations. I assume that's very similar to Obama's lecture in Cairo. The letter to Gamal Abdel Nasser was particularly important. Kennedy hoped to establish a special line of communication with the Egyptian leader and to strengthen links with the most important of the Arab governments. He referred in his letter to the Palestinian refugee issue and expressed a generalized intention to seek a solution. But the issue was placed firmly on the diplomatic agenda when Kennedy met with Israel's Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion pressed for and was accorded an early meeting with the new president. They met in New York at the end of May 1961, just a few months after the inauguration, for a meeting that lasted over 1.5 hours. The meeting touched on 3 issues: the recent American inspection of Israel's nuclear reactor in Dimona, the Soviet supply of superior jet fighters to Egypt, and the consequent Israeli request for anti-aircraft Hawk missile systems, and the refugee question. Kennedy informed Ben-Gurion that the US intended to resolve the refugee problem once and for all and to disband UNRWA. Although the president did not go into details, for a week prior to the meeting and in the weeks that followed, Israeli diplomats in Washington were made privy to the plans of the State Department to revive the policies of 1949-1950 and offer the refugees a choice between repatriation or compensation and resettlement. The repatriation would be phased over a number of years. The refugees would be screened so that those unwilling to live peacefully in a now Jewish state would be filtered out, and the returnees compelled to accept that they would not be able to return to their previous homes and villages, as most of these no longer existed. Under those terms, Washington was convinced that only a small minority of the refugees would wish to go back, and the rest would accept American-sponsored resettlement plans, either in the Middle East or elsewhere. These were the broad outlines of a plan that became the cornerstone of American policy in the Middle East for the next 2 years. That the United States intended to actively pursue a solution to the refugee problem, ending years of benign neglect, was further reinforced by a tense meeting between the Prime Minister and Adlai Stevenson, the US ambassador to the United Nations. The meeting was dramatic. Stevenson demanded that Israel accept the principle of repatriation. It's called today the right of return, but that's a term that wasn't used in the 1960s. The principle of repatriation, and implying that America would withdraw support from Israel in the forthcoming United Nations General Assembly debate on the Middle East unless Israel Israel indicated that it would comply. Ben-Gurion's response to his American interlocutors was that Israel would accept a degree of repatriation as part of an American-sponsored three-pronged plan: repatriation, resettlement, compensation, as long as the number of repatriees was limited. Prior to the mass immigration of Jewish refugees from the Arab world to Israel in the early 1950s, Israel had accepted an approach similar to this already, but with one proviso: that repatriation was only possible after a general peace settlement between Israel and the Arab states. In a concession to Kennedy, the Prime Minister now suggested that he would be willing to consider a degree of repatriation independently, that is, even before a formal peace agreement, in conjunction with an American-supported program for resettlement of the majority of the refugees elsewhere. Although the Israeli Foreign Office had clear indications prior to Ben-Gurion's trip to New York of an evolving American initiative on the refugee issue, there had been no internal discussion of a possible shift in Israeli policy. Ben-Gurion's apparent willingness in the meeting with Kennedy to consider the exercise of a limited right of return, even without a general peace agreement, had not been elaborated on, nor was it repeated in any of the frequent, almost daily discussions between Israeli diplomats and State Department officials. Nevertheless, it suggested a potentially significant shift in Israeli policy, and it stunned Ben-Gurion's aides. In correspondence with the Foreign Ministry, Israeli diplomats stationed in Washington, who had been present at the Kennedy-Ben-Gurion meeting, suggested that neither the President nor the Prime Minister fully comprehended what they themselves had been saying. The State Department also felt that the meeting had been ill-advised, as Washington had not yet fully worked out the details of its initiative, and the vagueness of American intentions left much room for uncertainty. Both the American and Israeli press gave extensive coverage to the talks between the two leaders, and rumors were published of a possible breakthrough on the refugee issue. On his return to Jerusalem, the Prime Minister was less than forthcoming at the weekly cabinet meeting of his coalition government. He denied the press accounts and dismissed discussion of the refugee problem with Kennedy as so preliminary and so inconclusive that it wasn't worth reporting on. In fact, however, something very profound was happening. Despite his public denials, Ben-Gurion recognized that the Americans were moving toward formulating an overall solution to the refugee problem on terms that were the most attractive terms that Israel would ever likely to be offered. In order to seize the opportunity, Israel would have to revive its agreement of 10 years previous to a limited right of return, and would also have to reverse one of the most basic tenets of its foreign policy, that this limited right of return could be exercised even before a peace settlement had been reached. Ben-Gurion was Israel's founding father. He had led the Jewish community in pre-state Palestine and later Israel, with only one brief 2-year interruption ever since 1935. He was the leader that pressed for the decision to declare independence in 1948 against the recommendation of important colleagues and of Washington. He had made the major strategic decisions in the war that followed immediately afterwards, and had been the undisputed leader of Mapai, the Israel Labour Party, which had dominated all coalition governments ever since independence. For years, Ben-Gurion had made all the decisions that mattered in Israeli policy. But his ability to set the course of Israel's affairs depended on his leadership of the Labour Party. Unfortunately now, in order to understand the course of the Israeli-American dialogue on the refugee issue, I must detour into a brief account of Israeli politics in the early 1960s. Within the Israeli system of governance, Israel's relations with its key friends and allies, especially the United States, were conducted through the Prime Minister's Department, and the crucial issue of arms supplies central for all Middle Eastern countries, including Israel, was managed by the Ministry of Defense. Except for a brief interlude, Ben-Gurion had held both portfolios. He was both at the same time Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. The Foreign Ministry was responsible for Israel's relations with the rest of the world. That is, anything that the Prime Minister didn't consider important enough for him to manage directly. Since 1948, there had been two foreign ministers, Moshe Sharet, widely considered a moderate opponent of Ben-Gurion's activist military policies, and since 1958, Golda Meir, who was summed up in a CIA briefing for President Kennedy in 1962 as of, I quote, limited intellectual horizons and completely under the shadow of her patron Ben-Gurion. I have that CIA report stuck up on my wall. Sharet had been hounded out of political life in 1958 and was succeeded at the Foreign Ministry by Golda Meir. At the time of his meeting with Kennedy in 1961, Ben-Gurion appeared to have a strong grip on affairs in Israel, despite his age. He was 74. There was also widespread consensus in Israel on the Palestinian issue. Moshe Sharet, despite his reputation as a moderate, and Golda Meir were both strong supporters of the policy towards the refugees first enunciated in 1948, they shall not return. And this became the prevailing orthodoxy, not just of the Labour Party, but of most political parties in Israel. Almost all of these certainties were overturned in the next 2 years. Unconnected to discussions over this coming period between Washington and Jerusalem on the new refugee initiative of the Kennedy administration, a parallel political drama was played out within the ruling Labour Party between 1961 and 1963. The party had been plagued by a controversy over a failed dirty tricks operation of Israeli intelligence in 1954, and a protracted vendetta between Ben-Gurion and the politician who held parliamentary responsibility at the time, Pinchas Lavon. I will spare this audience the arcane details, but the bottom line is that the party wanted to quietly push Lavon aside and sweep the affair under the carpet, while Ben-Gurion insisted, 7 years after the events, to hold a full and public judicial inquiry. Increasingly, the Labour Party grandees found Ben-Gurion's behaviour imperious and erratic. His unwillingness to accept the decisions of party forums, and instead to strike out on his own, left him increasingly isolated and created a brewing leadership crisis, culminating in Ben-Gurion's resignation from the Prime Ministership and from the Labour Party in June 1963. All this is in the future, but it is impossible to understand the course of the American-Israeli discussions on the refugee problem in these years without a sense of how embattled Ben-Gurion was becoming at the highest level of Israeli politics. Ben-Gurion's laconic and dismissive report to the cabinet on the talks with Kennedy did not reflect the true concern in Jerusalem on what had taken place. In fact, there was something of an atmosphere of panic in Jerusalem. 2 weeks after his return, he convened a meeting of his most senior Labour Party colleagues to discuss the Palestinian refugee issue. Unlike the cabinet, this was a forum with the ability to make real decisions. The 11 people in attendance included Golda Meir, Abba Eban, who was then Minister of Education, Moshe Dayan, who had been Chief of Staff, was now Minister of Agriculture, and Levi Eshkol, who was Minister of Finance and soon to be Ben-Gurion's successor. Moshe Sharet, now retired, was also invited to attend. The discussion took hours and was dominated by Foreign Minister Golda Meir. She recounted the main principles of the emerging American policy. Israel would be called on to allow the return of 10% of the refugees out of a total refugee population of 1,100,000. 100,000 by 1961. To allow the return over a 10-year period, while America would be responsible for resettlement and rehabilitation of the rest. Before the plan would be implemented, the United Nations, through the Palestine Conciliation Commission, would conduct a survey in the refugee camps in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon to establish the number of refugees willing to be repatriated to what was now Israel, and not to their previous homes, which no longer existed, and certainly not to historical Palestine, but to a Jewish state. Washington was confident that either the Arab states would reject the plan, or if they didn't, most Palestinians would prefer resettlement in the Arab world or elsewhere. That was their theory. But the Israeli leaders did not believe that an honest survey of refugee opinion could possibly take place. Golda reminded her colleagues of the parallel situation in the displaced persons camps of Holocaust survivors in Europe after World War II. In 1946, when an Anglo-American committee of inquiry had conducted a survey of the wishes of the Jewish survivors, Zionist campaigning in the camps ensured that the response was 96.4% in favor of migrating to Palestine, at the time under British control. Golda knew very well how refugee populations could be incited and manipulated. She had had a hand in orchestrating the outcome of the survey 15 years earlier. The Arabs would now do exactly the same to the Americans and the UN as the Zionists had done to the British. Golda spoke for a long time, surveying the practical difficulties of the American proposal and pointing out that Israel stood at a crossroads and was now forced to make a difficult decision. If Israel turned down the American initiative, it would stand alone in the forthcoming General Assembly debate on the future of UNRWA, and that debate was expected to be very difficult for Israel. On the other hand, she concluded her comments by saying that if the government accepted the American proposal, after the completion of the 10% refugee repatriation, the Arab population of the Jewish state would jump to 28%. I'll comment on her use of statistics later. Ben-Gurion himself said little at the meeting, restricting his comments to the need for a better public relations program to present Israel's views on the refugee situation to the world. Significantly, Moshe Dayan, ex-chief of staff and a close ally of Ben-Gurion in pursuing a hardline activist policy to the Arab states, spoke in favor of accepting the American plan, accepting some refugees even before a peace settlement, although he wavered under Golda's skeptical questioning afterwards. Dayan argued that resolving the refugee problem would greatly strengthen Israel's position when the time did eventually come for peace negotiations. Dayan's position was supported by Abba Eban. Other participants pointed out that Israel had already agreed in 1949 to a repatriation of 100,000 Palestinians, but that program had been suspended after 35,000 returned under a family reunification scheme. In principle, there were still 65,000 slots available, so the American demand was not as radical as the foreign minister made out. It would be possible to meet at least half of the American demand within the framework of existing government decisions, albeit from 1949, that had not been fully implemented. But the majority of those present were firmly against agreeing to the American proposal. Preventing a return of the refugees, certainly while a state of war existed, and certainly if it involved an element of free choice on behalf of the refugees as to who might return, was considered by the old guard of Mapai to be a matter of life and death for Israel, no less. But so was the matter of relations between Israel and America. Ben-Gurion himself said nothing at the meeting about accepting or rejecting the American offer. When the issue was finally discussed in the cabinet in early July 1961, the government accepted that in the framework of a peace initiative, Israel would resume large-scale family unifications up to a limit of 65,000, but that it would not say that formally until negotiations began with the Arab states. This cabinet decision was even kept secret from the American ambassador, who had been aware that the debate was being held. Nevertheless, Washington recognized that Israeli complacency on the issue had been ruffled. As an internal State Department memo noted, the government of Israel today is uneasy, uncertain, and secretly thinking on this subject for the first time. Let's keep them that way. In August, Washington's activism began to bear fruit. The United Nations Palestine Conciliation Commission appointed the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Joseph Johnson, to explore with the Arab governments hosting the refugee camps and with Israel practical means for seeking progress on the refugee problem. After 10 months of extensive negotiations with each of the governments involved, Johnson presented his plan in July 1962. It proposed a number of steps leading to a final solution. The first step would be to survey refugee opinion in order to clarify once and for all how many refugees wished to return. The overall conception followed the basic outline suggested in Kennedy's original talks with Ben-Gurion: a limited degree of repatriation, American support for resettlement of the remaining refugees, and a final dismantling of the refugee camps and of UNRWA. Israel remained highly suspicious of Johnson's recommendations, and there was extensive debate with Washington on technical details. Jerusalem insisted on the right to vet those refugees that opted to return, and wanted guarantees that the number would not exceed the 10% of the total population, 110,000 refugees. Furthermore, it would not give its final agreement until the Arab states had expressed their positions, in the hope that an Arab rejection would save Israel the difficult internal debate on refugee policy. Johnson's mission was extensively covered throughout the Middle East, and especially in the Israeli press. The cabinet received detailed reports on every phase of his progress and every detail of his talks when he visited Jerusalem. Public concern that the government might be abandoning its traditional refusal to consider repatriation was so great that Ben-Gurion was forced to make a statement to the Knesset in October 1961, reaffirming the view that there had been an exchange of populations, Palestinians in one direction, Jews from the Arab countries in the other, an exchange that could not be undone. In response, the State Department reassured itself that the statement was in fact just posturing, and that Ben-Gurion was indeed willing to consider a change of policy, which is ironic because all of the collected documents on the Middle East that we use to teach our students cites this statement by Ben-Gurion as the classic statement of Israel's position. But the State Department was right. It was posturing. That was no longer Israel's position. The cost of the Johnson proposal was estimated to be, in 1962 dollars, $1.377 billion. It's a lot of money in today's terms. Most of which was intended as compensation/inducement for individual refugees who accepted resettlement elsewhere instead of repatriation. Just a quick aside here. I have written extensively on Germany's negotiations with Israel and the Jewish world on reparations and indemnification. And it struck me as I was preparing this talk that that sum is suspiciously like, almost to the cent, the amount at the time when the Luxembourg agreements were signed in 1952 that Germany had promised to pay the Jews. Now, Washington was going to present a bill for settlement of the Palestinian problem. If Israel could only be restrained from rejecting the plan outright, Washington had engineered a very satisfactory diplomatic situation. If the Arab states accepted the plan, Israel would accept it eventually as well, if given appropriate assurances by Washington that it would not be overwhelmed with refugees. UNRWA would be disbanded and the refugee problem set on the road to resolution, even if the process took another 10 years. If the Arab states rejected the plan, both Jerusalem and Washington could claim to have made their best efforts. In order to obtain Israel's agreement, or at the very least to delay its rejection, Kennedy sent his closest Jewish advisors to speak directly with Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir at the same time as the American ambassador in Cairo was presenting the plan to Nasser. Mike Feldman, his legal counsel, and Abraham Feinberg, the supporter of the Democratic Party. A word about Feinberg. There is an interesting side story here. Feinberg was very much a well-connected American. He was a New York Jewish businessman who had been active. He was a fundraiser for the Haganah in 1947-48. So he was what Israelis call Ben Bait. He was a member of the family in Israel, and he had an in to everyone. Every account of Israel's nuclear program mentions Feinberg as the man who organized the funding for it. At exactly this period. I'm not sure of the significance of this. Not yet. Significantly, Feldman met separately with Ben-Gurion and with Golda. Washington was well aware that while Ben-Gurion had indicated a potential flexibility on the issues, Golda was resolutely opposed to any revision of the "they shall not return" policy. Kennedy's emissary came with two separate offers. Firstly, the US agreed to the Israeli request to supply Hawk missiles. It's the first time missiles were introduced into the weapons race in the Middle East. And in a personal letter to the Prime Minister, Kennedy assured Israel of its two crucial points: the refugees would not exceed 110,000, and that Israel would be allowed to vet those refugees that opted to return. Ben-Gurion agreed that if the plan was implemented in full, leading to a final resolution of the refugee problem, then Israel would agree to repatriate and resettle 10% of them. Some of the sources actually indicate that he mentioned the figure of 150,000, upon which Golda Meir kicked him under the table. Almost literally. Ben-Gurion had gone beyond the safe zone of his foreign minister. Relations between Golda and her longtime political patron were now at their lowest ebb. Internal party conflicts over the Lavon affair were reinforced by disagreements over Ben-Gurion's position on the role of German scientists in Egypt, which he dismissed as unimportant and Golda thought was a life-threatening fact, and long-term disagreements on Israel's nuclear program. Ben-Gurion was a strong advocate, Golda Meir was a strong opponent. She saw Ben-Gurion's concession on the refugee issue as completely superfluous, as the Arab states were certain to torpedo the Johnson plan even before Israel was called upon to take a public stand. However, once the Prime Minister had made an albeit informal commitment on the 10%, she was convinced Israel would be called on to honor it at some later date in the context of some other future diplomatic proposal. She drafted a letter of resignation, but party colleagues restrained her. Ben-Gurion's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and cut off from his colleagues, and the question of party leadership might come up at any time. Instead of resigning, Golda took the initiative in formulating Israel's response to the Johnson plan. The talks with Feldman had been confidential and outside of normal diplomatic channels. I intend to talk for about 3 more minutes. She now acted to take control. In October, Johnson returned with amendments to his original proposals. On 72 points, they deviated from the original proposals that he had presented to the government of Israel, and which Israel had undertaken not to oppose publicly. The most important change contradicted one of the two cornerstones of Israel's acquiescence. The right of veto over the returnees had been removed. Rather than revert to discreet personal diplomacy on the level of Ben-Gurion's correspondence with Kennedy, process as a whole. And I'll just summarize the rest of my talks. I've already talked for 3/4 of an hour. Golda traveled to New York ostensibly to attend the annual United Nations discussions on the refugees, but in fact to mobilize the American Jewish lobby, which she did very effectively, who then turned to Kennedy and said, it's not worth that you'll pay a high domestic political price. Kennedy, in fact, decides to abandon the plan by November 1962, but not to tell Israel and not to tell the Arab states. The State Department insisted that the Kennedy administration wait until the first Arab refusal came through, and the Syrians obliged, and quickly they rejected the proposal, and the Jordanian government followed suit. And as far as the world was concerned, the Johnson program was a non-starter. Significantly, the details of the plan were not published publicly. The governments knew, but the public didn't. Israeli diplomatic officials, ambassador in Washington and the experts within the foreign ministry, suddenly woke up to the fact in 1963 that Israel had lost what was very probably the best offer that would ever be made to resolve the refugee question. That if Israel was being called on to repatriate only 10% of the refugees, and America would take responsibility for the rest, that was more than Israel could have dreamt of. The program as a whole died with Ben-Gurion's resignation and withdrawal from political life in June 1963. There were subsequent minor efforts to keep the policy, or to keep some sort of refugee initiative alive in the years that followed, but they were all overwhelmed by the war of 1967. The emergence of the PLO in 1964, just as the State Department had predicted, and the identification of Palestinian refugees with an irredentist terrorist movement greatly facilitated the Israeli desire to shelve the refugee problem and block all calls on Israel to take the refugees back. Ironically, my final point, if Golda had been so concerned about the demographic implications of taking 110,000 Palestinian refugees back into Israel, the Israeli government, by its own hands, did exactly that with the annexation of East Jerusalem in June